Hi, this is an explanation and a demonstration about doing logics for History 101. You should be sitting down with your Doing History group right now to maybe stop this video, talk together, and work together as we go through this logic process. First off, what is a logic? A logic is just it's not a good name. It's not my name. I didn't come up with it. It's a tool for analysis of a document. One of the things that historians do is we look at documents and we draw meaning from them. And very often instructors will tell you, question the document, really examine the document closely. And it's hard to know what kinds of questions you should ask to understand a document or what you're really supposed to be doing when they ask you to read below the surface. So a logic is just a set of questions for you to ask a document. This is a history class, and so we're going to be looking at documents, but you can use a logic to examine anything that humans create. You could look at a steam engine and say, oh, who created that steam engine? Or look at a painting, or look at a piece of philosophy or a business plan. The only thing that a logic does is asks questions of a document to get you started thinking analytically instead of only looking at the surface of something and accepting it for what you see at first. We're going to do a practice logic together that's based on a document that you've had in Moodle. You may have looked at it already, you may not, it's fine either way. This is a page of really classified advertisements from a newspaper in Maryland in 1755. And we're going to start with the one in the top left corner. The first thing that I want to tell you about this, and this is just so you can read it effectively. At that time, the letter that looks to you like an F, as in frog, was actually an S, as in snake. So the first line of this advertisement says, ran away from the subscriber. And an Irish servant man, and the person who signed the advertisement is Basil Brook, basil like the herb. So just to kind of get your head around that, because I know you're reading it and saying, ran away from the subscriber from Basil Brook, so just had to tell you that. What we're going to do is go step by step through the questions of the logic and give you a chance to talk about it, and then I'll give you some possible answers. The first step in the logic is identifying the author. So talking with your group a little bit, not only who is the author of this document, but what can you tell about them based on the document, based on what it says, based on what you might know about Maryland in 1755. What kinds of things can you guess about the author of this document? So I'll give you a little bit more time to talk about some of the other questions, but now I know you're staring at each other and saying, I don't understand. So let's look at my answer to the author. Basil Brook, we talked about that, he signed it. You could also have said that the newspaper editor was the author, and although he printed it, he didn't actually write it. I think that Basil Brook is a better answer to the author. You should always include a date in the author. So even though there's no date in this advertisement, there are dates in the advertisements around it. And so we can guess that Basil put this in around April of 1755. From the name Basil, I assume that he's male. Could be wrong about that. I've made an assumption that he's male. Because he had an indentured servant, I've assumed that he's a landowner and that he's white. The fact that this goes into a newspaper, that he identifies himself as a subscriber of the newspaper, I assume that he's literate. So some of these things, we know for sure his name is Basil Brook. We know for sure that it was written in April of 1755. The other things are my assumptions about him, and that's okay. You're putting down what you think you know about this author. And notice that these are kind of demographic characteristics. This isn't his opinion. This isn't, his political ideology. This is just, he's male, he's white, he knows how to read. The next question is the audience, which means who was supposed to read this document? Who's the intended audience? And I can tell you right now that you sitting there with your group, maybe you're in Feinberg Library, maybe you're in your dorm, you were not the intended audience. I put this up here for you to read, but Basil Brook did not put this up for you to read. He was aiming towards somebody else. So who do you think, talk with your group about it, who do you think he was aiming this advertisement toward? All right, let's look at my answer to this question. It's pretty obvious, isn't it, that if he's put the advertisement in the newspaper, he expects people who read the newspaper to be the audience. So that's kind of the big picture. Oh, people who read the newspaper in April of 1755 in Maryland. And that's kind of like, who's supposed to do something? Oh, Americans. It doesn't really narrow your question down. So it's a start, but it doesn't get you all the way there. How do you think Basil Brooks was imagining these readers? I think that they were a lot like him. I think he's aiming toward landowners. I think he's clearly aiming toward literate people because they also are reading the newspaper. They were probably male, they were probably white, but not necessarily exclusively. We tend to think about people in that time period all being white and male because, that's just kind of the image that we have. But there were certainly female landowners. There were non-white landowners. They weren't a majority, but they were there. So we can assume that Basil Brook thought he was writing to white men, but it could have been a much broader audience of women and people of color that were actually reading the document, including enslaved people might be reading this to know, oh, who are they looking for? Who can we help get away? Next is determining the purpose of the document. And when you're looking at the purpose, you're talking about why it was written. What was the reason that a person did something? For an advertisement like this, it's pretty clear. I think you'll get it pretty quickly. But anything that you look at, we talked about looking at a steam engine. People don't just build a steam engine because, oh, I think steam engines are cool. They have a reason for building things. So anything that you look at, even a piece of art on the wall, the artist had a reason for creating that. And if we can analyze what that reason was, it gives us more information about the document or the piece of art and what its function is out in the world. So talk about this for just a second with your group, why you think this advertisement was created. Okay, you probably got that one pretty quickly because it's right there. He wants to get his servant back. So it's right on the surface. The purpose was to recover the runaway servant. If you want to get a little bit deeper and maybe think about it a little bit more, go to the next level. Why did he want to recover his runaway servant? Well, maybe it would have hurt his reputation as a landowner or his status in his society if he lost this servant, if the servant successfully ran away, maybe people would think he was less of a man. So you could say the purpose was to protect his reputation. Or maybe this Patrick Smith was his only servant and he'd spent everything he had to hire this one servant. If he ran away, he was lost. He was going to lose his whole farm. And so he needed to save that money that he'd already invested. So you can look at different levels of the purpose. Maybe it's just what he says, oh, I just want to get my servant back. But you can always go a little bit deeper. What was behind that first answer? and how do we figure out a little bit about what's driving the person who created this. Now, so far we've done 3 parts of the logic, and whenever you do a logic, I want you to stop for a second and look at the author, the audience, and the purpose, because those 3 things should make sense together. It makes sense when you think about it. This is the logic part. It makes sense that Basil Brook would expect newspaper readers to help him recover his servant, right? All of those things make perfect sense together. If you had chosen different answers to these 3 things, they might not make sense together. So look at this other example. What if we said that the author was Basil Brook, but the audience was actually Patrick Smith, that he was actually writing for his runaway servant to see, and that the purpose was to explain what servants were wearing, some kind of fashion blogger of oh, here's what servants are wearing these days. Does that make any kind of sense? I don't think it does. I created this obviously to be nonsensical, but sometimes I see this where students aren't looking at author, audience, purpose as connected pieces of information, but as independent pieces of information. And so I'll get these kinds of nonsensical things like Basil Brook is writing for modern day history students to understand that indentured servitude was a terrible thing. I might want you to think indentured servitude was a terrible thing. Basil Brook certainly didn't. So always go back and do this little double check to make sure that all of your author, your audience, and your purpose makes sense together. The last 2 parts of the logic are broader, what you might call meta thinking. It's not talking specifically about the document, but what you know and think about the document or the person who created the document. Concepts is looking at the key words and ideas that are necessary to understand the document. So let me just give you the example here, because this is one that students regularly have a difficult time with. So think for just a second, what do you need to know to understand this document? All right. The very first thing that I told you about the F being an S, if you don't understand that, you're scratching your head. You're puzzled through the whole document about this weird subscriber word. Then you need to know, what is a subscriber? Who is it that this is addressed to? We know that it's someone who's subscribing to the newspaper, who's getting the newspaper and reading it. But if you didn't know what a subscriber was, you could be like super confused about what's going on, who it is that's actually putting in this advertisement. Shillings, the reward that's being paid for Patrick Smith's return. This is a unit of currency. It's money. It's old British money. If you don't know that, you might think they're getting spices, 10 jars of shilling spices. It's spelled differently, I know, but it's a joke. They don't understand what these people are getting for returning Patrick Smith. And then I just threw in one more word that I thought you might be unfamiliar with. A fustian is a kind of fabric. It's like a jean type fabric. So he's basically wearing his denim jacket out as he was running away. There are lots of things that you can put down as a concept. Conceivably, you could put down every single word in the document and say, oh, if you don't understand this, you're not going to understand the document. But think about what are really the key concepts. You might be able to read this document and get the gist of it, even if you don't know what fustian is. But if you don't understand the F or S convention, there are parts of this document you're just not going to understand. You're not going to even know what the words are. So what I'm looking for in concepts is your ability to identify what ideas are really central to this document and what might be nice to know, but are kind of peripheral. And finally, the last piece of the logic is The assumptions, and students often make a mistake here, so please be careful. Assumptions is what you, the student, think the author was assuming. What beliefs did Basil Brooke have that shaped this document? So what did he believe in? And it doesn't have to be what he says in the document. It's kind of his foundational social assumptions about the world. So think about that for just a second. Look at each other, say, oh, I'm not really sure, and then I'll show you my example. All right. What beliefs led Basil Brooke to put this advertisement in the newspaper? He assumed that Patrick Smith was going to be in the area, that somebody else who was reading the newspaper was likely to see Patrick Smith. If he thought Smith had jumped on a ship and sailed back to England, there would be no reason for him to advertise in a Maryland paper. So he's made this assumption that Smith is going to stay in the area. And then the reward that he offers, 10 shillings. I don't know how much 10 shillings was worth in 1755, but clearly Basil thought that 10 shillings was going to be enough to buy this information. And if it couldn't buy it from a landowner, maybe there was an enslaved person or another servant who was ready to turn in Patrick Smith for these 10 shillings. So he's made this assumption that that reward is large enough. This is the kind of thing that we're looking for with assumptions. He never says in here, I think 10 shillings is a great reward. He never says, I think Patrick Smith is going to stay in the area. But he has those beliefs, he's made those assumptions, and that led to the way that he created this document. So every time you do a logic, you're going to be answering these 5 questions. You have a handout that includes a little template for you. Once in a while, students will make a whole bunch of copies of those templates and just use those throughout the semester. I totally don't expect you to do that. The one that I have handwritten here, I don't know if you can read my handwriting or not, but you can see the general format that I've just given a title to the logic so that I know what document it's referring to, listed author, audience, purpose, concepts, assumption, kind of in bullet points. Most of my answers are not sentences. They're just answers. They aren't full sentences. The only place you really need to have a sentence is in purpose. Purpose has to have a verb in it. It has to be a sentence. Somebody is doing something, or there's no purpose. I can't just say servant as a purpose, right? There has to be a thing that happens. Concepts always has bullet points. It's just 1 or 2 words, bullet pointed. The other things, just kind of jot down your answers. The structure doesn't matter. And if you write a whole bunch of information, it just makes it harder for me to grade. So kind of keep it simple. Don't worry about sentence structure and paragraphs. That's for different assignments. Logics can be used everywhere. I know I said that at the beginning of this lecture, but I want to say it to you again. It's a tool that we're going to use throughout this semester, but it's not something that's just used for history. It's not something that, oh, just Dr. Gordon gave me this thing that I have to use because she's weird. Logics are just a set of questions. So when your English professor tells you to read this document critically, you don't know what that means? Pull out your logic question and say, okay, well, who wrote it? Why did they write it? Then you're beginning to think critically. If you're in a science class, or if you've just, you're walking down the street and you see a billboard and it's like, what's going on with that billboard? You can pull out these logic questions. Who created it? Who's supposed to see it? Why was it created? What do I have to know to understand this? And what assumptions are behind it? Those are going to be useful questions for critical thinking no matter where you are, not just in this class. So now with your group, you're going to finish the rest of this quiz on Moodle that gives you a chance to do some logics on your own.